We continue on with book one in Mere Christianity, and we're looking at the remaining two chapters, chapters 4 and 5. And in this video, we're going to talk about Lewis's views on the implications of the moral law that he discussed more thoroughly in the first three chapters. Now, before we continue, just a little bit more on the whole purpose of the book, as I see it at least. I don't really view it as a book on apologetics. It's not quite apologetics, though there are arguments in the book that could be useful for apologetics. It's not theology, again, though there are portions of the book that are rich in theology, but that's not his purpose. And it's certainly not biblical exegesis. He wants to describe Christianity in a way that's consistent with Scripture at the least, but he's not trying to take particular passages and explain exactly what those passages mean. So, what is his purpose? From my view, I think that Lewis is trying to write a work that is going to help people who are in the situation he was prior to becoming a Christian. He was an academic, he was a reflective person, he wasn't a philosopher or theologian, but he had questions about Christianity, and he decided to explore those and eventually became a Christian. So this is the idea here, is that this is an explication of what Christianity is and what reflective Christians believe, and then in many cases why they believe the way that they do. And so in chapter 4, he wants to talk about what's behind the moral law. Now, just as a quick reminder, the law of human nature is the moral law. This is above and beyond the actual facts about humans behave. It's a real law. Humans didn't invent this. It isn't from culture. It's not something that we were socialized into, but we are aware of this law that tells us how we ought to live. Now, ever since we humans have been able to think rationally, reflectively, write down our thoughts and argue, we've wondered about how the universe came into existence. And many people, and we'll get to this later as well, concluded that the universe didn't come into existence. It just always has been. And so there are two primary views going back to the ancient world on how you might explain the existence of the universe. Now, there has been a third view developing in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. It's been modified in various ways, so we'll consider that in a moment or two as well. But the materialist view has been around for as long as we can reflect on the nature of the universe. And the idea here is that space and matter just happen to exist. They have always existed, and that's the view of the materialist view throughout most of history. That has changed with awareness of the Big Bang and the idea that the universe did have a beginning of existence. And that's caused some problems for this materialist view, but they've adjusted. And over time, right, just by a fluke, really, by chance, nature produced creatures like us who are able to think. So there's no purpose in humans. We just happen to come about from the universe. And of course, the competing view would be the religious view. And according to this, what's behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else that we know. This thing that's behind the universe is conscious, it has purposes, it prefers some things over other things. And to be a little bit more particular, there might be many other purposes for the world, but one of the important purposes for us is that the universe is here to produce creatures like the being that's behind the universe, in this sense at least, that these creatures have minds. So can science, contemporary science, help reinforce that materialist view? This is the view of many people, that science will tell you that the scientific materialist view is correct. But Lewis argues science really cannot tell you which of those two views is correct. So he gives a little argument here. Suppose science became complete, and we don't have to have one person who's omniscient, but suppose science is entirely complete so that science knew everything about the whole universe that is in the universe, that is in the space time continuum, matter, space, energy. Science knew all about it. Well, even then, the questions, why is there a universe? And does the universe have any meaning, would still remain. So if there is something behind the universe, it will remain unknown by the investigations of science, or it's going to have to reveal itself in some other way. So, how to decide? There's one thing, Lewis argues, that we know much better than what we can learn from external observation, what we can learn from scientific investigation. And we not only observe humans, we are humans. So we have this inside information, if you like, since we know how we believe, act, think, reflect, what we're aware of. So if somebody were to study humans from the outside, just externally, not knowing our language, maybe studying only our behavior, like we study electricity or insects or fish or something like that, they wouldn't have the slightest evidence that we had a moral law. Certainly, there are people who kill other people, right? There are people who do atrocious things to other people, and you wouldn't be able to tell that there was some kind of moral law at all. Observations can only show what we actually do, but the moral law is about what we ought to do. And Lewis argues that with rare exceptions due to something that's gone horribly wrong, we are all aware of this moral law. So if there were something behind the universe, how would it reveal itself, right? If there was some controlling power outside of the universe, well, it couldn't reveal itself as just another fact about the universe, right? That then it would be part of the universe, so not something behind the universe. So the only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves, right? As a command, trying to get us to act in a certain way. In other words, the moral law, right? That's exactly what we found. Fine. Now, Lewis acknowledges at this point, this is a long way from the Christian God, but it is something, and we may even capitalize the S there, something, capital S, behind the universe that appears within us as a law telling us what we ought to do. And it makes us feel uncomfortable when we do wrong, when we go against the moral law. Now, we said there was a third option beside the materialist view and the religious view, and that's what Lewis calls the life force philosophy. For him, he appealed to Bernard Shaw, Henri Bergson, as proponents of this kind of emergent evolution, right? And the idea here is that there is a purposiveness in the life force that brought us about. So we're not here merely by chance. So this has taken various forms in the 20th and 21st century, from the New Age movement into, Jediism or something like that. So when you're feeling well, the sun's shining, you appreciate the wonders of the universe, things are going well, it's nice to think about some great mysterious force that has brought you about. Right? So Lewis says there's some appeal to this life force philosophy. And another appeal is that, of course, if you do something rather rotten, if you go against the moral law, the life force won't care. It's blind. It doesn't have any morals. It's not going to interfere with what we want to do, like the God we heard about as children. So some children would say how you describe God, and God's the one who doesn't want you to have any fun, right? Tells you not to do things. Of course, that's not at all the way Christians actually view God, but that is a common view. So, in the 5th chapter, Lewis goes on to talk about this cause to be uneasy. And he's talking big picture first here. So just think about, of course, if you make a mistake in math or in doing a logic proof or something like that, the sooner you admit it and go back and start over, the better off you are, right? You don't get better by working harder when you've already known that you've made a mistake. And unfortunately, that's a human tendency, right? Progress isn't stubbornly going the wrong way, but we kind of tend to do that. We work harder going the wrong way. We go faster toward in the wrong direction. But sometimes you just have to go back. And even if that means going back to the religious teachings you once discarded. Now, it's fairly obvious, says Lewis, that humanity is on the wrong track. So we do need some correction. Of course, he was initially giving these talks during World War II. It's not as if everything got wonderful after that war. And clearly, here in the 21st century, we are still dealing with war and people who abuse power and all the terrible things that he was familiar with. Now, you can, however, find out about God from the moral law. And there's one thing that we can learn that about the moral law itself is it's not an indulgent thing. It doesn't care how hard something is to do. If it's the right thing to do, you're supposed to do it. So if God's like that, then God is not soft. So we can learn something about God from the moral law. Another reason to feel uneasy or to carry on this thought is that the trouble for many is part of us, right? We're on his side, right? We agree. He disapproves of human greed and exploitation, and we're all for that, right? Those greedy corporations, those people who exploit others, the sex trafficking. We agree with those things are horrible. And yet, again, another part of us kind of wants him to make an exception for ourselves, right? We realize that sometimes we're greedy and sometimes we exploit other people and sometimes we use our power to get our own way through manipulation or what have you, or whatever else might be against the moral law. Now, God wouldn't be good if the standards are not consistent. So if he disapproves it in others on a big picture, he also disapproves it in a small picture with us as individuals. And if the universe is governed by absolute goodness, then it really must hate much of what we do. And if we're honest with ourselves, we can agree with that point, considers Lewis. Now, on the flip side, if the universe is not governed by absolute goodness, well, there's really no hope that things are going to turn out well. It doesn't matter, we can create a United Nations, but that doesn't stop North Korea and Iran from doing abusive things, and not to single them out, as all kinds of other countries are doing things that are problematic, including the United States at times. There's just no hope, really, that things are going to turn out well if all we have is humanity to depend on, and the universe itself isn't governed by absolute goodness. So we can't do without it, but we have a hard time dealing with it because we recognize our own faults. So God's the only possible comfort, but he's also the supreme thing to fear. And here, Lewis kind of wraps up this idea about this moral law to get us to a point of Christianity. He says, once you realize that there is, in fact, a moral law, and that there is a power behind the law, one who wants us to behave in certain ways, and we recognize that we've broken that law, that we fail to fulfill the law, and so we've put ourselves in the wrong with that power behind the universe. It's only then that Christianity begins to speak clearly. That's where Christianity starts to make sense. So we are going to explore that then in the next few videos, especially talking about what Christians believe in book 2.